Securities offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through CWM, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC is under separate ownership from any other named entity. Carson Partners, a division of CWM, LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors. This is The Way to Wealth, with host Scott Ford, a jiu-jitsu fighting, woodworking, beekeeping entrepreneur who is also the managing director, partner, and wealth advisor of Carson Wealth. Financial freedom is the goal, and clarity and simplicity is how we'll get there. Let's get to it. This is Way to Wealth.
Hello, and welcome back to the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple so you can fully live and fully live today. Back with our guy, Jake the Rock Stone, with another episode. So welcome back to the Way to Wealth podcast, Jake.
Thank you for having me. Third time's the charm, right? So I believe we're at the third, so it's awesome.
It's what it is. Let's do it. Absolutely. So that, we talked about doing a podcast on inflation. So the interesting thing about it is it's literally built as part of our process, part of the Way to Wealth process, So, if you just walk through the process, of course, we talk about living now, we talk about the team, we talk about the foundation, then we talk about three buckets of money: the savings bucket, the income bucket, and the growth bucket, and they're all different. What's the third bucket, right? So it's WEAL, what's your foundation? And then you talk about the E, establishing savings. Then you talk about A, all expenses covered by income. Then we talk about L. What's L in wealth? Living with inflation. That's the growth bucket. So kick us off, Jake. Just give me some thoughts. What are you hearing people say about inflation, the concerns, and then what are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. So, we believe that inflation is really a silent tax, but I don't think it's been that silent over the past 5 or 6 months or so. And one thing people don't remember is that inflation does not discriminate. It doesn't matter what social class you're in or what position you have. I mean, everyone looks at gas prices. That's the number one indicator. You have, rent tenants, paying more because just the cost of expenses are going up. So there's no way to really come out unaffected, no matter who you are. And then inflation, it's defined by the purchasing power of money losing value over time. So you talked about the growth bucket. I mean, when we talk about the process of bringing people through, we always say that's your inflation hedge, right? So, inflation's the highest in 42 years. We're at 8.6%. Hopefully next week, when the Federal Reserve, makes their announcement to raise rates again, that we'll hear that the inflation numbers have gone down. But 8.6%, you have to look to the growth bucket to do that. That's why we have it segmented that way. But going back to the interest rate hikes, that's how they combat inflation. I say they, the Federal Reserve, that's the monetary policy side of things. And so that's to drive down demand, which increases supply. But one thing that we've seen with a lot of people is, and I'll actually use Scott Kuby on our investment team at Carson out in Omaha as an example, because inflation did not go down in the last couple rate hikes. So it's really stayed the same and actually increased right in May. So it'll be interesting to see what the June numbers do. But the reason why we say that is people have had cabin fever the last 2 years. And so people are complaining about prices of goods, but we're still spending. I think AAA came out with some data saying it was the highest traveled year for automobiles and airplanes since 2012. And people had money to spend. And so Scott Kuby, going back to that example, he said, we went on a family vacation, complained about the gas prices and compared the different stations, but we still went on vacation because we just haven't been able to do that in over a year. We've been pushing it out and we're ready to do it. So it's real, but it's going to be interesting with how much longer it lasts with the interest rates being hiked.
Yeah, for sure. And what happens a lot, I've heard through the years, I hear it currently, is people retiring, and specifically those that are retired. Because look, typically while working, one of the best ways to keep up with inflation is having a stable job where you have stable income that helps with that income to offset inflation. And that's comforting. Transitioning into retirement, I get it. It feels like, ooh, like you don't have that guarantee, right? And a cost of living via Social Security and otherwise just aren't keeping up with inflation at the grocery store or at the gas pump, which is what people are feeling. So I totally understand that. And, a lot of research has been done on this. And if you just really distill it on all down, how do you keep up with it? Well, you got to grow beyond it. And that's where, when you look at people in stocks, the argument is over a course of time, that's been likely the most simplistic way to keep up with inflation, right? So if you don't have the job, then stocks is an option. It's why we created Way to Wealth like this. So you have the safety, the savings bucket, the income bucket, and the growth bucket. Because if you just don't lump it all together and then you see this volatility and then you see the inflation, you're like, what am I going to do? Whereas you have 1 year in savings and then you have at least 10 years of expenses covered, then over here, 10-year and beyond money, we can swing for the fences, so to speak, meaning let's get growth, which that's the whole point of living with inflation. You got to have growth to be able to keep up with inflation. So definitely want to talk about options, like what asset classes make sense to keep up with inflation. But before I do, any other thoughts on Way to Wealth and the 3 buckets as far as the methodology to navigate times just like we're in 2022?
No, I don't have anything other than, it's how do you outrun it, right? That's the thing, what everyone wants to know. How do you get ahead? And so, yeah, definitely can ease into that topic.
So let's talk, Jake, a little bit about how do you keep up with inflation? I mean, how would you allocate? And specifically, people retired, that's the concern. But even not, if you're a business owner and you have a business, it's still a question mark. What are some asset classes, and how could you potentially look to allocate to yourself to keep up with the current environment that we're in?
Sure. So someone who's working, and I'll use you and I as an example, right? Where you have the income, that's really your income bucket. So the issue that you have is your savings, right? That's going to be a huge lagging indicator of what banks are going to be offering with interest rates, right? So even your savings at the bank or the credit union or what have you, it is not keeping up with inflation. So the money that you have back there for opportunities is not keeping up with inflation. And then you skip the income, you go to the growth. Remember, we're still working. Your dollar cost averaging, buying equities, or if you're a business owner, buying other small businesses or stakes in it, that's your growth piece, right? That's our, home run hitters that we want to have pay off 10 plus years down the road. So, before I get into kind of a recommendation, one thing that we always like to ask people is, what's your expenses that you need transitioning into retirement? That's going to define that income bucket, and then it's going to define the savings. So when we set up a plan for someone who's about to retire, we always look at, okay, this growth is something we're not going to touch for 10 years. There's a reason the first 2 are set into place. So what's going on with the market volatility, it's not affecting, right, what is being determined by income. Because when we're working and we have good cash flow, we're not really worried about the market as much as someone who's retired. So the mindset changes versus a working individual doing a plan versus someone nearing retirement.
Totally. Yeah, totally agree. And that's the thing is just it's why segmenting like this, just the idea is to help with the psychology and the comfort of, look, I know that with the volatility and with the inflation, we get caught up in the year. Like right now it's 2022. And yes, we need to navigate that. And we also have to look at it in a context of a lifetime. And that's why we segment the way we do. So, this is 10-year. We need this money working for us in areas that can actually get through, grow beyond inflation, which is stocks and others. So let's talk a little bit about that. So one thing, we talked about the gas pump. You go and you pump and you fill your car up and you're like, holy crap, are you kidding me? what took me $100 if I drive a Ford F-150. So what was taking $90 to fill up is probably more like 140 or something. Like that's a big increase. And so I certainly can empathize and sympathize with those that are in that. When you're in retirement, you don't have that income from the salary, and it's like that's a big expansion because you're still needing to go places, like Kubi said, on vacation. So what can you do to navigate? Well, one thing would be owning commodities, owning natural resources like gas, owning companies that make it, produce it, certain stocks or equities that benefit from rising gas prices. So now, instead of just being a consumer at the pump, yes, you're at that end of the inflation. If you invest in those who can benefit from it, then you're like, I'm kind of navigating that and washing it out. Yes, I'm a consumer on one end, but I'm an owner on the other. So commodities could be one example of an asset class and a way to navigate and actually benefit from a rising inflationary type environment.
Yeah, and another way is, and when you look at the savings, right? Some people say, well, one of the options that we can always say how to outrun inflation is using dividend paying whole life insurance. And so I'm going to get to that in a second, how that works. But when people think of inflation, and it's actually very common in the area that we live here, I'd say, Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, most people, they want to pay cash for a home or 15-year mortgage or pay it off as quick as possible. But the problem with that is, the more you're paying towards principal and interest, that money is no longer working for you. So that's not helping your inflation hedge. That's not helping your income. You're taking a lot of cards off the table and, less tools in your toolbox that you have to work with. So we always see people that, they get tangled up between an opportunity that comes along, whether it's a retired person or a business owner. And it's like, man, well, where do I pull this? Because I'm paying an extra $1,000 for the mortgage. And we always say, why? And that's our job, is to get to the bottom of that iceberg, right? So psychology of money, trying to figure out what people's thinking are. And then what we always do is we say, okay, and I'm a numbers person, so that's black and white, right? So this is what it looks like. And when you look at measuring backwards, okay, so inflation is the dollar losing value over time, but it also can play to your benefit moving backwards on two things. One is the mortgage, coming back to that topic. And so this is just an example of using a present value calculator. So if your mortgage payment, say, is a 30-year, $1,000 a month that included principal and interest, and say we use an inflation rate of 2.5% every single year, that payment in present value 20 years from now is only going to feel like about $610 a month. So what that allows you to do is to be able to put either more into growth or more into your savings for current opportunities, because it's actually working in your favor. Because remember, you have it locked in. It's not changing. It's a fixed rate for 30 years. And we always say to people, well, I want to live in retirement with my house paid off. And we always say, who's your beneficiaries? The kids? Okay, well, if you had a 30-year mortgage and you were to pass, what would they do? Well, they'd sell the house. Well, if you had a 15-year mortgage, what would they do? They would still sell the house. And then if it was no debt, they would still sell the house. So the point of it is, it just doesn't make sense. And the key of it is you having the ability, asset-wise, to pay it off if you wanted to, but choosing not to, because using that time value of money in your favor is a way to utilize that. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is when you look at dividend paying whole life premiums. So you remember, you're building that cash value. Okay. So you're using that emergency opportunity funds. Not only can some of those policies earn 5-6% interest, right? And remember, using a mutual company is important. It can, one, more than likely out earn the savings account, still keep up with inflation. That cash is accessible, but say your premiums every year is $20,000. That's not changing. The insurance company doesn't come to you and say, hey, we need $22,000 next year. That's not how that works. So $20,000 in 20 years is not going to feel like $20,000. And what you're doing is you're building up that cash, one, for opportunities, two, it's tax-free. And then there's all of other types of benefits, different riders you can have with long-term care or even tied to it. So it's an interesting tool, but that's how we measure backwards, because paying off the home is something we definitely don't want a client to do. Now, psychology of money, some people just, they have it ingrained in their mind, which is fine. We work around that. But when you look at the numbers and the success of a plan, especially when you segment money, it definitely can be night and day.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great example and a great way to think about it that most people miss, Jake. So if you think of, again, the process we look at is 3 buckets: the savings, income, and growth. So we're talking about what could we do in savings? What can we do in the income bucket? And what can we do for growth? We talk growth. We can own assets that can, participate and do well in an inflationary environment, or own stocks or equities, ideally that's growing faster than inflation. You're giving examples of how we can do something today. 2, by measuring backwards. 1 would be having a 30-year mortgage. Why? Because over that span, that payment 10 years from now is still $1,000 a month, but it's going to feel like maybe $700 a month. So you're measuring backwards. So actually having a mortgage can benefit you in an inflationary environment. Same with another tool that we use in bucket 1, all kinds of savings vehicles. 1 would be dividend paying whole life. People get that confused because they think it's an investment. It's not an investment. It's a savings asset class. What's unique? Same thing. You can benefit from inflation because that $20,000 a year premium that you were referring to in 10 years may feel like $16,000 and may actually equate to that, but it's still 20 you're putting in that you're accumulating. So measuring backwards for sure, ways that you can benefit from an inflationary environment or, navigate an inflationary environment. And the other thing I would add to that is people miss 2 things here as well. 1 is debt and liabilities. If your 30-year mortgage, I got all this debt. No, you don't. You have a liability. You owe this. But if that asset's greater than the liability, it's a different way to look at debt. It's a liability. So who cares, right? It doesn't, what's the big deal? And I get it psychologically. Remember that you finance everything you buy. So if you're using capital and money to pay off this debt or truly liability, you just gave up what everyone misses, which is opportunity cost. That dollar's now gone. It's sent to pay off that home and can never be used for anything else in the future. So that's why measuring backwards in an inflationary environment, realizing you finance everything you buy, whether you do it through a mortgage or whether you pay with cash, you're still financing it because you're giving up the opportunity cost that you're never going to be able to use that dollar again for opportunities in the future.
Yeah, and then I'll always go back. You're exactly right. Robert Kiyosaki, if you ever listen to him, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He actually posts his podcast with YouTube videos if you're a visual person, and he illustrates certain things. But people also forget that mortgage payment, okay, yes, you have property taxes, just like I have to pay a tax to renew my car registration every year, but you don't pay taxes on that, say, $1,000 a month payment as either. So what happens is, because we do believe taxes are going up, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires. So what happens is when you just pay off all of that at one time, people say, well, I'm going to save money because I don't have to pay taxes and whatnot. So remember, debt is tax-free. That's how money is created. That's how money is circulated around the world. And so that's just another thing to think about. That $1,000 payment you never are paying taxes on that. Like I said, you have property taxes, just like you have a toll, right? If you ever travel on a toll, it's not a toll road, it's a tax road. So you're paying for it, for the construction or upkeep of it. So that's just something to think as well, is because it's just not applied to a mortgage. And that's where, like you said, outrunning inflation, people say, well, how can I outrun it backwards? That's how you do it. And it doesn't always have to apply to the growth bucket like we were talking about.
That's exactly right. Right. So thinking of options. So you gave 2, we could think about mortgages, let's say a 30-year mortgage. Instead of paying for it with cash, we could use, in this case, you mentioned dividend paying whole life with a mutual company for a savings vehicle, that premium is locked in, and the premium is a deposit into your system is locked in. So that could help navigate and benefit from an inflationary environment. Bucket 1. Bucket 2, income. What are some options in the income bucket that we could think of? So, certainly what comes to mind for me, we talk stocks. So we could look at stocks that are paying a dividend. Or you do some sort of covered writer option strategy to bring in income in the stock portfolio. And you could look at consumer staples, utilities, or other specific stocks that pay good dividends and that actually benefit from inflationary environments. So you could consider that for bucket 2. You also could consider debt instruments. You could consider TIPS, right? Treasury inflation protected securities as a way to navigate it. You could consider real estate investing. If you own properties, that can benefit from inflation because you're controlling the rent. And then again, you're back to that mortgage piece you mentioned earlier. You could finance it. And then it's a hard asset, typically favorable in inflationary environment. Or you could do a real estate investment trust. And then that income is helping because it's in the income bucket. So it's working for you, bringing in income. So there are some other ways to think about navigating the income bucket in an inflationary environment. Any other thoughts on the income bucket or options there, Jake?
Yeah, those are all good points. And one, because we're in a time of market volatility, right? And so the people who are suffering the most, who one, take out too much income, which we try to coach through and work with budgeting and whatnot, which, I know I'm not a big fan of budget, but sometimes situation presents itself and have to make changes. But those are the people that really are new to the process, haven't put it into place. And so the reason I'm getting that at is, bonds are just as volatile as equities right now, right? So, you're going to get the yield on it and everything that comes with it. But the key is to hold on to individual bonds so you can make a whole, right? And so bond funds are volatile and whatnot. Still a good tool to have is for diversity purposes. But one reason as well, so say the market is down, let's say the market just hypothetically is down 10%, right? And you're taking 10% of that portfolio, which is too much. 4 to 6 is a sustainable range from that, right? And inflation kicks in. So you're losing value on the account, right? Inflation is making those dollars worth less. And so people say, okay, well, what do I put in the income bucket? And we've seen a lot of ways to utilize something like a fixed indexed annuity, something like that, because, it won't go down due to market volatility. Now, if it doesn't capture the full upside, but at least inflation isn't impacting that income bucket. And then, you can have different lifetime, withdrawal benefits for you or your spouse. You set them up different ways. But that's another way to kind of have the inflation hedge being taken off of an asset that's also losing value, because that's a double-edged sword, right? And, we like to implement that for some folks. And I'll raise my hand and always say, when I first came in the industry, I had a bad taste just by the word annuity. But when you take a step back, widen your perspective, and then you say, okay, this actually falls in for a purpose. And when you look at all the benefits of it, it can really help someone to, during volatile times, to have income that's not going to be affected by the market, which isn't going to be affected by inflation either.
100%, Jake. Yeah. And there's a reason you had a bad taste, as did I. I started in the industry in the early 90s in insurance. So I got a distaste and started the Cornerstone in 96 and turned away from that and went to, fee only asset management late 90s and never looked back. And then, several years ago, we re-looked it, because here's the thing. The reason for the bad taste is it's why the Weight of Wealth was put together. Because the team, the number 2 in Weight of Wealth, determines, as we talk about, the A team. What matters is understanding how everyone's compensated and how it's done in a way that's in your best interest. Because if someone only sells products and that's how they're compensated, then when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So everyone should have X, Y, or Z. That's never the case, and nor is that a great way to operate. However, it's a tool. So could it be used in an overall plan based on someone's objectives? Of course, if it's thought through and you don't have a vested interest one way or the other in what they use or how they use it to solve for the challenge. So it's the whole point of Weight of Wealth. So when I think through, just the design of the Weight of Wealth, it's literally designed partially for inflation. Right? Because it's the growth piece, it's that growth bucket. And we've given, I think, some good examples. So if I'm listening into this, I'm like, okay, Team's important. We talk about a foundation. We talk about 3 buckets. Why does it matter? Well, because, okay, there's a lot going on in the world, but I know I got a year of savings set aside. You gave examples there. Could be a mortgage you could use to benefit yourself. You could use dividend paying whole life as your own banking system. 2 is the income bucket, to make sure my expenses are covered by income producing assets. At least 10 years, some want it for the rest of their life. And then 3, we do need to grow to keep up with inflation. And we said in the income bucket, real estate, dividend paying stocks, option writing strategies. There's several ways to benefit yourself there. And then in the growth piece, we could own equities. You could do that with a diversified portfolio, a stock portfolio. You could own a business. What I would say is, we talk a lot about what resonates with you, right? I mean, what does real estate make sense to you? Does owning businesses via equities make sense to you? Do you have a niche in business and owning a business? Does that make sense to you? Really being congruent with your investor DNA, who you are, what makes sense and feels right to you. Warren Buffett says that, really understanding and knowing what you own and why you own it. That's where the real power is, because the risk is really rarely in the investment. It's in the investor. It's why we do these podcasts. It's why we put out material for education purposes, because that's where the real risk is. When you understand what's going on, then you know what to do. Anything else you would want to add on inflation in today's podcast, Jake, as far as how to combat it, or any other things that we didn't talk about you would want to add?
The only thing I'd want to add is, because I'm reading Simon Sinek, Start With Why, right? So if no one's ever read it, it's very, very good. And I know, Scott, you have the why in our process. It's why we believe in it. So the why is, we want people to create freedom. That's why we do this. That's why the process is in place. So when I say create freedom, it's financially, so you can do the things that you love and, not have to be worried about now or the future. So with that being said, when we go through the process and we show all these options, tools to utilize, that's our job as a fiduciary. One is because we don't want to be the person that, didn't listen or didn't understand, because maybe there's a tool back there that can help. So that's why our number one job is to listen, get to the bottom of the iceberg. But the why is to create the freedom. And so I always encourage people, one of my favorite sayings is, take a step back, widen your perspective, because there's things out there that can work. We've seen it work, and we can show examples of it working. And the why behind it is for freedom. So if I can show you that it's going to create financial freedom for you, then why would we not move forward? And so we've used that a lot with clients and prospects, showing the process, and it really seems to resonate.
Yeah, that's good, Jake. I've heard it. And Kiyosaki says this too. I think it's where I heard it, but there's 2 sides of the coin, and there's also the edge. It's good to stand on the edge and be able to see both sides. And that's what we do. And I think everyone should, show up with no agenda, no dog in the hunt. Let's be able to stand on the edge of the coin, see both sides, and then with clarity, okay, this is what seems to make sense to me. And then as a client, to be able to do the same thing, or at least be working with someone who can see both sides, doesn't have a bias. That's what a fiduciary does, is be able to say, with all these different things that are going on in the economy, all the different options that are out there, all the different conflicting opinions, let's simplify this, which is the idea of the way to wealth, make this simple, and be able to not have a bias and really understand the whole picture holistically. And then most times the what to do presents itself when you don't have a bias or an agenda going into it. So I love that feedback, Jake. Thanks again for being on. Obviously, we'll have you back. Love doing it, doing it with you here and sharing with the audience. So we'll have you back on, as that came to me last time. Jake the Rock Stone is going to be your radio call name, I think, moving forward. So all good, man. Thanks for being on, Jake. We'll have you back. And audience, thanks again for joining the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple so that you can live fully, and you can live fully now. Catch you next week.
The opinions voiced in Way to Wealth with Scott Ford, Managing Director, Partner, and Wealth Advisor of Carson Wealth, are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial, or tax advisor prior to investing. Legato Family is not affiliated with Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC or CWM, LLC. Carson Wealth, 19833 Leitersburg Pike, Suite 1, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21742.